Okay, so let's get some practical application for the for loop and actually write some code that utilizes the for loop besides the bug collector like we did in the last video. I really suggest that you turn to page 404, and I'm working on problem number 1, and pseudocode or take some time to look at the problem before you watch this video. Try to pseudocode out the logical steps so you have that in your mind before you start watching this video, where otherwise it'll just seem like I'm throwing up random code and it's not going to have as much meaning. So I'm going to continue on and assume that you have done that. I don't need to spend time on a video doing it because we've certainly spent enough time pseudocoding, and I think you all are pretty good at it. So I'm just going to assume that you're pseudocoding it, and I am actually following my own pseudocode in order to make sure I get these steps logically in order. So the problem is asking us to enable this teacher to put in, for any number of students, each student, she wants to put in 3 test scores, and it says we're creating 2 loops, an inner loop and an outer loop. So now we're also going to start to implement nesting, what we call loops inside of loops. So we're going to use that in this example. We're going to be doing that. So our outer loop is keeping track of how many, is looping through the number of students. So for this code is repeating for every student she wants to put in, and then we're going to put an inner loop that loops through 3 test scores. So for each outer loop, which is each student, we are going to inner loop, put in three scores, and print out the average for that student. Okay, so let's just jump in, and hopefully you're pseudocoded some kind of idea, and we'll just start rolling here. I'm going to set up my variables. I'm going to create test scores, which is a integer, and test scores is what I'm going to get each score from the user. I'm going to keep a running score of the 3 test scores that are put in for each student. So total test scores is going to be 3 test scores for each student, so that way I can average them at the end. Any more is going to be a flag that I'm going to use to ask the teacher if there's any more students that she wants to put in. In other words, giving my outer loop, which is going to be a while loop, the ability to stop. And then I'm going to use a string called, I'm just going to do a little extra there. I'm going to create a string called student, in which I'm going to ask what the name of the student is. That's kind of outside of the requirement of this problem, but I'm going to do it anyway. All right, so the first thing I'm doing is I'm creating a while loop that is looping through each student. So that's my outer loop. That's the main loop that's going to be running through my code. And the flag that's keeping that going is this variable called anymore. And so as long as anymore is equal to y, my loop will keep running. Okay, remember the double equal sign is a comparison. So I need that. In other words, is this value on the left-hand side of the equation the same value as on the right-hand side of the equation? So remember, the double equal signs is important here, because if it was just 1, I'm actually assigning y to this variable. I'm putting y into anymore, which is not my intention. My intention is to compare the two to see if they're equal. So while anymore is the same as y, we want to do something per student. So I think just to get my code started, I think you should always work in small bits and pieces and make that work, and then add more to it. In other words, let me get my while loop working first before I attempt anything else. And the while loop is running through each student. So I think what I'll do is I'll say student equals input. What is the student's name? I'm going to abbreviate because I don't have much space here. Student's name, question mark. And so each time I go through the loop, I'm getting the name of the student. And I'm not going to worry about the test scores now. Let me just get one piece working at a time. And the first thing I want to make sure that I get working is this while loop. So I want the while loop to keep going until what condition is met, this condition of anymore. So I'm going to then anymore equals input more students. Again, I'm abbreviating. You might say, are there any more students? But I don't have much space here. So and so as soon as the user enters in anything besides y, that should trigger my while loop to stop. And so I'm just going to end let me just type and then I'll say what I'm doing. Thank you for running my program. Okay, so what I'm doing now, again, I'm just building little pieces at a time and making sure it runs before I build the whole complex thing. And plus, it's easier to take things at a bite-sized piece. So I don't care about the test scores right now because that's something, let me get the while loop working first. And so my idea is that this while loop will keep running, keep asking for students until somebody puts in something besides a Y. So ideally an N, but all I really care about is that it's not a Y, which will end my while loop and then print thank you for running. I suppose maybe just to make sure I know it's running, print student, so that I know that it's working. Okay, so let's see that happen. So I'm going to run, and it's asking me for a student's name, so I know I went into the while loop at least once. So maybe this is Betty. And I hit enter and it printed Betty. So I know this is working. More students, it's asking me this flag question. I'm going to say yes to indicate that I want to put in another student. Oh, it did go back into the while loop. So I know that the Y is working. Maybe this one's name is Tom. Oh, Tom. Okay. So it printed out Tom. This is looking good. And then, do I have any more students? I think I'm all done entering students, so I'm going to put in something besides a Y. And it did, in fact, end my while loop. So at this point, I'm confident that this code is working, and I've set up part of the solution to my program. And I really suggest that you work in these small bite-sized pieces and test and get small pieces running and then add to it as you go along. And so now that I know that I'm looping through and I'm getting students entered, for each student, the requirement is I need to input for each student 3 test scores. And so I know that it's 3. And so anytime I know how many iterations I need to, how many loops I need to loop through, or how many iterations I need to loop through, in this case I know I need 3, it's a good candidate for a for loop. And so I'm going to inside my while loop, and I know that it's inside my while loop because it's indented. Remember, everything is indented is what's going to be done in the while loop. Anything not indented and is in the same flush line with the while word, the while keyword, is not part of my while loop and will run after the while loop is finished. So inside my while loop, I want to, per student, loop through a for loop, getting 3 test scores. So let me just get that started. So I'm going to do for I in range, and I'm going to do 1 to 3 this time. So the first time I goes through, it's going to be 1, the second time it's going to be 2, and the third time it's going to be 3. And so at the end of this, I'm going to know that I is equal to 3, which I can use in my average calculation. So let's just see this work. So I need to get the test score. So I use test scores. Test scores is equal to int input score. I'm even going to get kind of fancy here, and I'm going to put I. Okay, let me just type it all out. So, okay, so what I've done here is for my greeting, for my prompt to the user, I have this string score, and then I'm also asking it to print out this variable. So it'll print out score 1 the first time, it'll print out score 2 the second time, and it should print out score 3 the second time. Actually, we need this to be 4 because remember, it's not inclusive. So now it'll do 1, 2, 3, but not including 4. So we're getting 3 test scores, and then let's see, we got to keep a running total. Total test scores. And I'm going to use that shortcut, plus equals. So whatever was in total's test scores, add to it. Keep a running total of whatever was put into test scores. Okay? And so the way that this works is a loop within a loop. So while the while is looping, we go into the while, and it's going to generate the first student. So the first student is whoever, Betty. And for Betty, this loop will run 3 times inside the while. So Betty will run 1, 2, 3 times. We'll exit the for loop, finish out the code, and then go back to the outer loop. So you finish the inner loop before you go back to the outer loop, and we won't be asked again. So let's see this in action. So after the for loop is finished, let's print the student afterwards. Hopefully by running my code, it'll make sense. So I'm going to print the student, and we'll say print. Let's see, let's put a print total score is, and then we keep a running code total with total test scores. And then we'll print the average. Print average is, and then total test scores. And you could either do divided by 3, or remember when we're finished with this loop, I is also 3. So instead, I'll put this in parentheses to say, make sure you do this calculation first, okay? If you're uncomfortable with this format, it's not any different than doing, maybe I could set up a variable called average equals, this is going to be a float. And so if you're more comfortable doing it this way, for now, that's fine. Average is equal to, and I can take our formula here, our equation, and put it here. So I could do it this way. I could get the average first. Oops, that should be average. And put the average into our print if you're more comfortable with that. Either's doing the same thing. Also, if you're more comfortable not wanting to deal with I or keeping track of the fact that that is running 1, 2, 3, you could also put 3 if that's more comfortable. So I'm just giving you different ways to do it. So the idea then is, let's just run this and see how it works. First of all, make sure I don't have any syntax errors. Student's name, well, we'll put in Betty. And it looks like I have an error, so let's see what our error is. Oh, right. Okay. It doesn't like the fact that I put this plus sign here because this is an input, and we've been using these comments on the print. So we can do this comma on the print, but we can't do it on the input. So I'm just going to leave it off for now, and we'll look at it later. Actually, what you could do, no, we'll just leave it off for now. Let's just leave it alone, and I'll address that later. So in the input, you can't put commas. You have to put a plus sign if you want to concatenate, and we'll deal with that later. So for now, let's just keep the fact that it's a string and acknowledge that I made a mistake, and you're just going to ignore the fact that I put a comma and an I, and I'll deal with it in another video. So input score. Let's run that. That was an oversight on my part. So let's see, Betty, score. So the first score, we'll give her 95. The second score, we'll give her 100. And the third score, she got extra credit and got 105. So what I hope that you're seeing here so far is that while we're in the outer loop, so we're currently in Betty's loop. Betty's loop ran this for loop 3 times. So for 3 times, we were prompted for the score. Once we exited the for loop, so we're still in Betty's test score, we're looping through Betty's test scores, we printed the student, we printed the total scores, which kept track of our running total, and then we also printed out the average. And now it's asking us for any more students. So at this point in time, if I put Y, we're going to continue to loop through the outer loop, which is our while, which is our second student. So let's go ahead and give that a try just to see this working. So I'm going to put the Y, and it's going to, now we're inside this block of code, inside that loop. And it's asking for the student's name, and this student's name is Tom. And now we're in this for loop that's looping through 3 times, looping through this code 3 times. Remember, it starts at 1, our I starts at 1, and it will loop up to, but not including 4. So that'll give us 3 iterations of asking us for the score, keeping track of the total scores. So let's get that part done. Maybe Tom did great here. He bombed this one, and he did pretty good on this one. So now we're at the point where it printed out the student, it printed out the total scores, and it printed out the running total. It printed out the average. It printed out we calculated the average, and it printed out the average. And now it's here in this part of the code that's asking us for any more students, giving us this flag for our outer loop. Do we need to keep looping through this outer loop? So can you see how loops are starting and ending inside bigger loops, which are still running. So we've got loop-de-loops, loops running and starting and stopping inside bigger loops that are running and starting and stopping. So I think at this point I'll say no, which will end our outer loop, and it should then print out our final statement, which it does. I know that was a lot to assimilate, but we'll do more examples of this in some upcoming videos.